There are crimes that shock a nation for a moment. And then there are crimes so calculated, so cold, and so complete that a century later the world still has no real answer for how a human being arrived at them. This is the story of a quiet town in Michigan, a school full of children on the last day of class before summer, and a man who had spent months planning their deaths while smiling at them across the hallway. To understand what happened in Bath, you first have to understand what Bath was. In the early 1920s, Bath Township sat in the heart of rural Michigan, 10 miles northeast of the state capital of Lansing. It was the kind of place that barely registered on a map. No traffic lights, no police force, no real commercial center, just flat farmland stretching in every direction, a grain elevator at the edge of town, a small drugstore, and a few hundred people who had known each other their entire lives. Doors went unlocked at night. Neighbors helped each other bring in harvests. And if someone fell ill, the whole township knew by morning. The same families had worked the same land for generations, and the rhythms of life there were slow and predictable in the best possible sense. A survivor named Donald Huffman, who was 9 years old the day everything changed, would later describe it simply as a little farm town where you knew everybody within 20 miles. That was Bath. That was the world those children grew up in, and it matters to hold that picture clearly, because it is only against that kind of world that the full scale of what happened makes sense. It was precisely the kind of place that believed deeply in its future. And in the early 1920s, the community made a decision that reflected that belief. For years, children across Bath Township had attended a patchwork of small one-room schoolhouses scattered across the farmland, each one serving a handful of students of mixed ages and grades all at once. The system was familiar, but it was outdated. Communities across rural America were beginning to shift toward a new model, consolidating their students under one roof, dividing them by age into proper grades, and giving them access to better teachers and more resources. After years of local debate, Bath Township voted to do exactly that. The Bath Consolidated School opened in the fall of 1922. It was a two-story brick building, proud and solid, and it was the finest structure the township had. More than 200 students enrolled across 12 grades. The classrooms were bright and properly separated by subject. There was a real basement and a proper stage and a gymnasium. Parents who had themselves attended cramped one-room schoolhouses walked through those doors and felt something that was difficult to name, a sense that they were giving their children something genuinely better than what they had received. The school quickly became the heart of community life. It was where the township gathered for meetings, where children performed plays at the end of term, where the rhythm of the academic year gave the whole place a kind of shared calendar. It was, in the truest sense, where the township's future lived. The children who attended that school were, for the most part, the children of farmers. They walked to class in the mornings along dirt roads, came home in the afternoons to help with chores, and grew up understanding that the land required work, patience, and a long view of things. Their world was small in geography and enormous in familiarity, and that is the specific texture of a small agricultural community. The way everyone's life is slightly entangled with everyone else's. The way a loss in one house is felt across all of them. Building that school had come at a cost. A property tax levy was imposed on every landowner in Bath Township to fund the construction. For most residents, it was an acceptable price. The school was worth it. They had voted for it. They believed in it. For one man, that tax was the beginning of everything. Andrew Kehoe was not on the surface a man who raised alarms. He had grown up in Tecumseh, Michigan, one of 13 children in a large Irish Catholic family. His mother died when he was young, and his father eventually remarried a woman considerably closer in age to Andrew than to his father. Kehoe did not get along with his stepmother, and what was known, though never formally investigated, was that when he was in his mid-teens she died after the family's oil stove exploded. The fire soaked her clothing and spread across her body, and Kehoe stood and watched her burn for a perceptible moment before throwing a bucket of water on the flames. Water that, given the oil-based nature of the fire, only spread it further. She died from her injuries. No charges were ever brought, and the record noted it as an accident. But some who knew the family believed the stove had been tampered with beforehand. Whether or not that suspicion was ever more than suspicion, Kehoe moved forward with the polish of a capable young man. He was a strong student, particularly in physics and anything mechanical, and he went on to study electrical engineering at Michigan State College, an unusual and sophisticated education for a rural Michigan farmer of that era. He understood circuits, wiring, timing mechanisms, and the behavior of explosives in a way that almost none of his neighbors did or ever would. In college, he met a woman named Nellie Price, from a comparatively well-off Lansing family. They married, and several years later the couple purchased a 185-acre farm outside the village of Bath, paying half in cash and taking out a mortgage for the remainder. To look at Andrew Kehoe on that farm in the early 1920s was, on the surface, to see an ordinary man living an ordinary life. He was active in the community. He helped neighbors when they needed it. He was considered intelligent, articulate, and civic-minded by those who knew him casually. But the people who actually worked alongside him, who lived next door, who sat with him at meetings and dealt with him in any sustained way, described something quite different underneath that surface. He was meticulous to a degree that unsettled people. He changed his shirt twice a day, sometimes more, never allowing himself to appear even slightly dirty or disheveled while working in the fields. While every other farmer in Bath wore practical overalls and work clothes, Kehoe worked in a full suit, and he never seemed to break a sweat. His neighbor Monty Ellsworth, who knew him as well as anyone did, and would later write the first published account of what happened in Bath, described a man who was always tinkering, always trying to make machines do more than they were designed to do, hitching extra mowers behind his tractor, attaching additional drag sections, endlessly modifying and experimenting. He preferred machinery to farming. He was happiest with a wrench in his hand and a problem to solve. As a direct result, the farm suffered. He spent so much time in mechanical pursuits that he never truly managed the land as a farmer should, and the crops and the finances reflected it. He was also a man who held grudges with a precision that his neighbors found unsettling. If he felt slighted, he shot his neighbor's dog because it barked occasionally near his property, a dog that had never crossed onto his land. He had beaten one of his own horses to death. He removed himself and his wife from the Catholic Church in Bath because he refused to pay the required parish assessment, and then, to ensure that Nellie could not attend without him, he prevented her from going at all. He accumulated grievances the way other men accumulated debts, quietly and methodically, each one adding to a growing interior ledger that he never settled and never forgot. When the school opened and the tax levy arrived, Kehoe became openly furious. He told neighbors that the taxes were illegal, that the school board was mismanaging public money, and that the entire arrangement was a fraud imposed on hard-working landowners like himself. In 1924, he ran for the school board and won the position of treasurer, and to the people who did not know him well, it seemed like the constructive response of a man who disagreed with how things were being run and had decided to get involved and change them from within. What the position actually gave him was unrestricted access to the building. On the board, Kehoe was a constant and exhausting disruption. He voted against the other members on nearly every issue. And when he did not get his way, he moved to adjourn the meeting rather than allow a vote to proceed. He withheld the superintendent's paychecks, cut Emery Hoyke's vacation days, and blocked his annual raises. He tried on multiple occasions to have Hoyke removed from his position entirely, arguing that the superintendent had no legitimate standing to even be present at board meetings, and he accused him repeatedly and without evidence of financial mismanagement. He was the kind of presence that turned every meeting into an ordeal and wore down everyone in the room. Meanwhile, the rest of his life was unraveling. The farm, never well managed, was falling further into debt. It is worth pausing on that moment, not because a single lost election explains what followed, since nothing adequately explains what followed, but because of what that defeat represented to a man who thought the way Kehoe thought. He had spent years constructing an internal version of himself as someone wronged by an unjust system, a man of principle surrounded by people who could not see what he saw. Every tax bill was evidence of corruption. Every board vote against him was evidence of conspiracy, and every time Hoyke walked into a meeting and sat down, Kehoe saw an enemy who had been allowed to keep winning at his expense. When the township voted against him in that election, it was not in his mind a democratic result. It was a verdict, a final public declaration that the community had chosen wrong over right, and that he would be made to pay for it. Men who have constructed that kind of interior world do not accept verdicts. After the election, Kehoe stopped farming entirely and withdrew almost completely from daily life. A neighbor named McMullen noticed the change, noticed that Kehoe had abandoned the fields, and that the farm had gone strangely quiet, and became uneasy enough that when Kehoe offered to give him one of his horses as a gift, McMullen returned it. He was worried about what it meant that Kehoe was giving things away. What none of them knew, what none of them could have known, was that Kehoe had already begun. Farmers in Michigan in the 1920s used dynamite as a routine tool for clearing land. Breaking up old tree stumps, splitting boulders, opening up new fields for planting, these were all common uses, and no one in Bath paid particular attention when Andrew Kehoe made a trip into Lansing in the fall of 1926 and came back with boxes of dynamite purchased from a sporting goods store. Neighbors assumed he was clearing stumps. They had heard him blasting on the farm before. There was nothing about it that required a second thought, and Kehoe had understood that perfectly when he planned the purchase. He had already, through his position on the school board, volunteered to carry out maintenance and repair work at the Bath Consolidated School. He offered specifically to fix the electrical wiring in the basement, framing it as a gesture of community service, a board member using his technical skills to save the township. The cost of hiring a contractor. Kehoe began working in the building regularly, often in the evenings and after hours alone, with the kind of access that came with being trusted. No one accompanied him to the basement, no one inspected his work, and no one had reason to. He was a board member doing the community a favor. What he was doing in that basement had nothing to do with electrical wiring. He had spent weeks studying the layout of the building before he ever brought a single explosive through the door. He knew the subfloors, the crawl spaces beneath the classroom floors, the gaps behind the pipes and beams that ran through the basement ceiling. He brought the explosives in small quantities on each visit, calculating precisely what he could carry and conceal in a single trip without altering his appearance or behavior. He slid into the crawl spaces and worked in the dark, placing dynamite and a World War I surplus explosive called pyrotol behind pipes and between structural beams, directly beneath the wooden floors of the classrooms above. Over the course of several months, working carefully and without interruption, he wired more than 500 pounds of explosive material into both wings of the building. He connected the charges to alarm clock mechanisms, timed to detonate at a specific hour of the morning, during the part of the school day when every classroom would be fully occupied. Back at the farm, he was preparing the rest of the plan with the same methodical patience. He cut all of the wire fences on the property, stripped a ring of bark from every shade tree and fruit tree on the land to kill them slowly from within, and cut his grapevines at the root before replanting the stumps to conceal the damage. He gathered loose lumber and stored it in the tool shed, where he had wired a separate incendiary device. The 2 horses remaining on the farm were tied in the barn with their legs bound by wire, positioned so that no rescuer arriving in time would be able to free them. Sometime in those final days, Andrew Kehoe murdered his wife. Nellie Kehoe had returned home from one of her hospital stays. The autopsy would later find severe trauma to the skull. Kehoe moved her body to a farm outbuilding and placed her in a wheelbarrow. He arranged beside her a small chest containing silver keepsakes, objects he knew she had valued. It was an act that sits at the center of everything strange about Andrew Kehoe, the cruelty, and a residue of something that resembled tenderness existing in the same gesture, carried out by the same hands at the same moment. No explanation was ever offered for it, and none has ever satisfied. A few days before the attack, a 5th-grade teacher named Blanche Hart contacted Kehoe and asked if she could bring her class to his farm for a picnic that coming Thursday. Kehoe agreed. Then he called her back and suggested she move it to Tuesday instead, saying it might rain later in the week. His neighbor Ellsworth, who later pieced together the sequence of events, wrote simply that he supposed Kehoe wanted the children to have a little fun before he killed them. By the morning of May 18, 1927, every element of the plan was in place, and Andrew Kehoe drove toward town. The morning of May 18th was like any other spring morning in Bath. The school year was ending, and children walked toward the building in the warm, early air, knowing that summer was only hours away. Teachers were preparing for the final day of term. Parents were making plans for the afternoon. The township was going about its morning in the way it always did, and nothing about that morning gave any sign of what was already ticking beneath it. At around 8:45, the Kehoe farm exploded. The house, the barn, and every outbuilding on the property detonated in near-simultaneous blasts. The sound was heard and felt for miles in every direction. Windows rattled across the township. A column of black smoke rose into the morning sky that was visible as far away as the edge of Lansing. Neighbors came running from every direction, and people drove toward the farm from across the township assuming a catastrophic accident, a gas explosion, or a fire that had consumed the whole property in an instant. 2 neighbors reached the farm just as Kehoe was pulling out in his Ford pickup truck. He stopped, looked at them without visible agitation, and told them calmly that they were his friends and should get out of there and head down to the school. Then he drove away, and they stood in front of the burning farm trying to make sense of what he had said. At 9:45 in the morning, the north wing of the Bath Consolidated School collapsed. The alarm clock detonator had triggered exactly as it had been set to do. The blast moved upward through the wooden floors and into classrooms filled with children between the ages of 7 and 14. The north wing ceased to exist as a structure in a matter of seconds. The roof came down, the walls folded inward, and the force of the explosion threw children, desks, and books through the air. First-grade teacher Bernice Sterling, who survived, would later tell the Associated Press what it felt like from inside the classroom in the moment it happened. She said the floor seemed to rise several feet, that after the initial shock she believed for a moment that she had gone blind, and that the air was suddenly full of children and flying furniture, with some children thrown high toward the ceiling and others hurled through openings in the walls. The sound of the explosion reached every corner of Bath Township within seconds. People who had been driving toward the farm fire heard it behind them and turned around. Within minutes, the scene outside the school was beyond anything the community had encountered or prepared for. Parents arrived to find the north wing in ruins. Farmers who had been working their fields drove to the school and climbed directly into the rubble without equipment, using ropes and bare hands to lift sections of collapsed roof and reach the children beneath. There were no emergency protocols, no trained response teams, and no chain of command. There was only the instinct of people who recognized the voices coming from the wreckage and the willingness to pull and dig until every child was accounted for. Monty Ellsworth, among those who arrived early and stayed through the afternoon, described what rescuers were working through in terms that have never lost their weight in the telling. He wrote that beneath one section of collapsed roofing there was a pile of children 5 or 6 deep, some with arms extended through gaps in the debris, some with legs visible, some with only their heads protruding, all of them coated in a layer of plaster dust and blood that made them unrecognizable even to parents who had seen them that morning. He wrote that it was a miracle that more parents did not lose their minds entirely in those hours, and that it was not until 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening that the last child was finally lifted from the ruins. Approximately 30 minutes after the school collapsed, as rescuers were still working through the debris and the injured were being laid out on the grass, Andrew Kehoe drove his truck into the schoolyard. He had loaded the bed of the pickup with dynamite, with nails, with metal scrap, farming tools, and shrapnel of every kind, packed in a way designed to produce maximum dispersion at close range. As he pulled up to the school, Superintendent Emery Hoyk walked toward the vehicle. In the chaos of the rescue operation, surrounded by parents and neighbors and surviving children, no one yet understood who had done this or that. The man in the truck was the reason they were all there. Kehoe detonated the vehicle. The blast killed him, killed Hoyk, killed 2 other adults in the immediate vicinity, and killed a boy who had survived the first explosion and had made it out to the schoolyard. When investigators eventually worked their way into what remained of the south wing, they discovered 500 additional pounds of unexploded dynamite and pyrotol, wired to an alarm clock detonator set to trigger at the same time as the charges in the north wing. The mechanism had failed. Whether through a fault in the clock or an imperfection in the wiring, the south wing had not detonated, and Kehoe had intended the entire school to come down at once, killing every person inside it. The only thing that had prevented that outcome was a mechanical failure too small to see and too random to have been planned for. The final count was 45 dead, including Kehoe himself, with 38 of those killed being children between the ages of 7 and 12. 58 people were injured. Some families lost more than one child on the same morning. In a community of 300 people, the loss was not a number. It was the shape of everything that came after. Bath did not have time to process what had happened before the outside world descended on it. By the first weekend after the attack, an estimated 50,000 vehicles had passed through the township. People drove in from every surrounding county and from towns across Michigan, some out of genuine grief, some out of the need to offer sympathy in the only form they knew, and some out of a curiosity they probably could not have explained to themselves. Traffic jams formed on dirt roads that had never seen more than a handful of cars at once. Funerals were held in private homes across the township over several consecutive days because there were too many of them to hold anywhere else. And the burials ran from that first Friday through the weekend until the last of the dead had been laid to rest. Investigators worked quickly through the ruins of the farm and the school. They confirmed that Kehoe had acted entirely alone, with no outside help, no collaborators, and no connection to any organization. At the coroner's inquest, his death was ruled a suicide. His body, largely destroyed by the truck explosion, was claimed by his sister and buried without ceremony in the paupers section of a cemetery in St. John's, Michigan, in an unmarked grave. His wife Nellie was buried separately by her own family in Lansing, under her maiden name of Price, a deliberate choice that served as its own quiet statement about who she had been apart from the man she had married. Wired to a fence post among the ruins of the farm, investigators found a painted wooden sign that Kehoe had prepared in advance. It read, "Criminals are made, not born." It was the only message he left, the closest thing to an explanation that anyone ever found, and it has been studied and debated in the decades since, without anyone arriving at a satisfying interpretation of what he actually meant by it. Whether it was intended as a manifesto, as a self-justification, as an accusation directed at the community, or as something darker and more personal, no one has ever determined with certainty. The national response in the days that followed was generous and in many respects remarkable. People from across the United States sent donations and letters. Michigan's governor created the Bath Relief Fund, drawing contributions from private citizens and state funds alike. A Lansing architect donated his services and drew plans for a new school building at no charge. A Michigan senator wrote a personal check for $75,000 toward its construction, an act of individual generosity that made the new building financially possible. A statue was eventually placed on the school grounds, a bronze figure of a girl with a cat, purchased with pennies collected by school children from across Michigan, a precise and quiet act of solidarity between children who had never met. Classes resumed that September in the community hall, the township hall, and 2 borrowed retail spaces because the damaged school wing was still being demolished and the new building was not yet ready. Most of the surviving students came back and continued their education in the same small town where 4 months earlier they had watched neighbors pull their classmates from the rubble. The community did not scatter. It stayed and it rebuilt, and the new school was dedicated the following summer under the name of the senator, whose generosity had helped make it possible. Then, 3 days after the attack, Charles Lindbergh completed the first solo non-stop transatlantic flight in history, climbing into a small aircraft in New York and landing in Paris to the kind of celebration the world reserves for moments that feel genuinely new. The newspapers, the radio broadcasts, and the public's collective attention shifted toward Lindbergh almost instantly and completely. The reporters left Bath. The national coverage stopped. A community still in the process of burying its children found itself suddenly and bewilderingly alone with what it was carrying, and that is largely how it remained for decades. What happened in Bath became, in the broader American memory, almost entirely unknown. The story did not enter the cultural conversation the way later tragedies did. It was not replayed, analyzed, and returned to in textbooks or news cycles. And for much of the 20th century, even people in Michigan did not know it had happened. The survivors, for the most part, did not speak about it. Decades later, when researchers and documentarians went looking for them and for their families, they found people who had waited the better part of a lifetime for someone to ask, and who still, when the moment came, could barely find the words. One documentary producer who worked directly with survivor families described the town's silence as something that had held for generations, not because the community had forgotten, but because the event had grown too large and too close for ordinary language to reach. Silence was not indifference. It was the shape that a certain kind of grief takes when it has nowhere left to go. There is a painful irony in how forgotten Bath became, because what happened there was not a footnote. It was the deadliest act of mass murder ever committed at a school in the United States, a record it holds to this day. It was the first school bombing in American history, and it was, as investigators and historians later confirmed, the world's first suicide car bombing, a method of violence that the 20th century would come to associate with conflicts and ideologies far from a farming township in Michigan. Researchers who study mass violence still return to Bath as a foundational case. Medical journals have drawn on the documented pediatric injuries from the explosion to shape modern emergency response to mass casualty events. Psychologists and criminologists have used Andrew Kehoe's profile as an early and detailed example of what researchers now call the dangerous injustice collector, a person who cannot release perceived grievances, who constructs an interior world organized around resentment and wounded pride, who accumulates years of injury into a private case against the people around him, and who eventually concludes that the only adequate response is an act so irreversible and total that it cannot be minimized. Kehoe fits that profile with a precision that researchers consistently find instructive, not because the profile explains the scale of what he did, but because it maps the internal architecture of a man who could plan it calmly over months and then greet children in the corridor on his way to the basement. The school was ultimately demolished in 1975. In its place, the community built a memorial park, and at the center of that park stands the original cupola from the Bath Consolidated School, the only physical remnant of the building that was preserved. Around it, the names of the dead are recorded. children between 7 and 14, 2 teachers, a superintendent. The names carry no hierarchy, no arrangement by age or status, just the names of people who were present in that building on the last morning of the school year and did not come home from it. What happened in Bath, Michigan, in the spring of 1927, was not simply a tragedy in the way that accidents and natural disasters are tragedies. It was the product of years of private deliberation by a man who moved through the ordinary life of his community, attended board meetings, greeted teachers in the corridor, and worked alone in the school basement with complete calm because he had already made his decision and had nothing left to feel uncertain about. The planning happened in plain sight. The man who carried it out was not a stranger. He was a neighbor, an elected official, someone the community had chosen and trusted and given access to the building where the children were. And the question that Bath leaves to history, the question that no investigation and no psychological profile has ever fully resolved, is not really about Andrew Kehoe at all. It is about what it means to live in a community, to trust the people around you, and to build something together for your children, and to discover on an ordinary spring morning that the ground beneath it was never as solid as you believed. 45 people died, 38 of them were children, most of them between 7 and 12 years old, and it remains the deadliest school attack in the history of the United States.